Good morning. My name is Jaysin. Kind of half my intro was talking about what was just done on the intro. My partner, collaborator, artistically is, we go by Jaysin and Embryo, but I'll refer to him as my friend Aaron. We started DPI Comics first, actually, when we started doing web series, but slowly transitioned to DPI Studios when we started selling more of our artwork as prints at conventions. And yes, the DPI stands for dots per inch, because the majority of the artwork that we do has been touched in some way by a computer and created digitally. So the topic is fantasy. I figured I'd get a little bit of artwork up there quick, and that is the piece in question, Make-A-Wish. That was the cover art for the Expo art book one year. But I don't define fantasy just as the traditional Dungeons and Dragons, Lord of the Rings fantasy. I also include sci-fi, superheroes, steampunk, cyberpunk, those things that aren't grounded in our everyday reality. When I was asked to talk about this, one of the questions I was asked was, how do I tap into a fantasy mindset for the kind of work that I do? And I felt that was a really tough question. It's kind of like asking a fish, why do they drink so much? One of the things I'm going to include in this talk is the idea of life-changing moments. Growing up, I think that there are standout moments that really inspire us and stick with us for the rest of our lives. Most of my life-changing moments were rooted in a fantasy world. And so let me start this off by telling you about my youth. Playing Dungeons and Dragons and superhero role-playing games with my friends as a kid, creating adventures for each other to experience from our own imaginations. I grew up reading tons of comic books. I was a comic book collector. And certainly a standout moment was reading Frank Miller's The Dark Knight series at probably too young of an age. And that certainly stuck with me. My first artistic crush was Todd McFarlane, a Calgary artist. His style blew me away as a child, and I was lucky enough to meet him a number of times at conventions and comic book signings in town. And for my partner Aaron, just to point out, his was the comic book artist Arthur Adams. As a kid, I wasn't into scary movies, and at a junior high friend's birthday party, I was reluctantly convinced to watch the movie Predator. And that certainly changed things. When that alien came out on screen, wow. I then followed it up with James Cameron's Aliens and developed a massive obsession with the Aliens genre, which of course led me to the great artwork of H.R. Giger, yes. Then in 1988, I managed to catch the very first screening in Calgary of the North American tour of the anime Akira. And at that time, anime was pretty much relatively unknown in North America, and that just exploded in my mind. So much so I dragged my buddies to a second screening the next day because I knew I had to share it with them. And so the world of anime is a completely different genre and storytelling, and that led me to Ghost in the Shell with great artwork by Masamune Shirow. Star Wars is just kind of a given. And that was part of everyday life for kids my age growing up. And then my other true addiction is video games. I grew up in arcades. The kid in the bottom picture is not me, but it might as well be. And then, of course, home consoles and video PC games, getting lost in the world of Doom, Half-Life, Legend of Zelda, Resident Evil, Deus Ex. For music, a truly life-changing moment and kind of a bit of a funny retro story. Those of you who were alive in the early 90s may understand this. When my first Nintendo system was nearing the end of its life, the cable connector on the back of it wasn't working. So I realized that if I used the audio-video plugs, I could run it through my VCR and still get my game time in. Then what I also realized is if I unplugged the audio cable, I could change the VCR to Much Music. And so I could listen to Much Music while I was playing my video games. And I don't remember the game specifically, but I must not have been able to pause. And I was playing, and this song came on, and the raw aggressiveness of it spoke to my teenage angst at the time. And I fell in love, but I had no idea who did the song. So I needed to, Much Music had 8 hours of programming, and then it would loop. So I stayed up and waited for the 8 hours of the loop and timed it so that I could be there watching and see the little information of what that song was. And it was Jesus Built My Hot Rod by Ministry. And so that began certainly life-changing in more than one way. Infatuation with industrial music and trance and techno music, and when I listen to that while I work, it sends my mind on a journey to Blade Runner-esque worlds, and I just zone out and am able to focus on my work. So I always wanted to be a comic book artist when I was growing up. I was always drawing superheroes in class, even when I was supposed to be doing my work. In fact, I have the honor of being kicked out of every class in school at some point for drawing, including art. We were supposed to be painting, and I felt like drawing my superhero, so I was asked to go draw them in the library. Then, of course, the big life-changing moment in high school was when I met my collaborator, Aaron Norell. Right away we clicked, we had a lot of the shared interests, and we started working on our own comic book ideas and dreaming up worlds of our own. He was a better artist than I was, and so at the time I started inking his work instead of doing my own. But then, 1996, dating myself, I got my first computer. It was a blazing fast Pentium 150 with 64 megs of RAM and a 2.5 gig hard drive. I was very, very envious by my friends, envied by my friends. And so I started playing with Photoshop and learning how to color pictures and learning how to color comic books. And I would go on to message boards and forums with other professional colorists because digital coloring at the time was a brand new thing and we were teaching each other. I had the exact opposite experience trying to break into comic books than most people do. Most guys struggle doing independent small-time books and getting stiffed and not getting paid, but the work was getting published and they were getting their name out there, and eventually they move on to better things. I was paid for every single job I ever did. However, a lot of them were for books being pitched, and they were never picked up. So the work I was doing, getting paid for, but not really seen. And I was also ghost coloring for other colorists where I didn't get credit. And I realized that the deadlines involved with coloring comic books were a little bit too intense for me. Back then, a book was expected to be turned, a 24-page book was expected to be turned around in about 2 weeks. Nowadays, I hear it's in 1 week. So I moved on. I went to other things. 2005 was another couple of life-changing moments. This picture is called Thunder Twins. Aaron was doing commissions on a Dungeons & Dragons message board, just drawing people's characters. And in 2005, I had seen a tutorial on digital painting by an amazing artist and innovator in the digital painting world, Craig Mullins. After seeing his tutorial, it opened up my mind for different ways of painting in Photoshop, and this was one of the first pieces I did with that information. The other thing that changed in 2005 was we exhibited at the very first Calgary Comic and Entertainment Expo. We found out very last minute, the Thursday before the show, that we actually had gotten a table. So we stayed up all night at the office where I was working using their printer and printing prints to get ready for the show. And there we are. At our small little Artist Alley table. But we did very well that weekend. We made around $700 off our little Artist Alley table, and it was a life-changing moment for us because we realized that, hey, people like our work and they're actually willing to pay for it. So, and that...
What were you selling, sorry?
Pardon me?
What were you selling exactly?
The prints of just prints, limited edition prints of our work. Now, this brings up a slightly different topic that some of you may not be aware of if you don't attend comic book conventions. Fan art is the primary artwork sold throughout Artist Alley at comic conventions. These are drawings of popular copyrighted characters sold as prints and posters without approval by the copyright holders. It's a practice that's been going on for almost as long as there have been conventions, and it has straddled this gray area of accepted infringement. The San Diego Comic-Con has an Artist Alley of artists selling unlicensed print for sale 100 feet away from the Marvel and DC booths. It's certainly an interesting subject, and one could talk about that for an hour at least. Aaron never wanted to do fan art, so it wasn't a moral choice or anything on our part. It's just not what we were into. So we created our own ideas and created our own drawings and characters. But it's understandable why people create fan art. The comic book convention market is fierce, and without being able to catch people's attention as they're wandering the hall with characters that they're already aware of, original artwork can often go unnoticed. It certainly would be nice if more people sought out original work, but when you see people wandering the convention and they have that deer in the headlights look, being overwhelmed with the sensory overload, it's understanding why they tend to go towards what they already know. And for us, we were lucky that our artwork just coincidentally happened to look a lot like a very popular video game at the time, World of Warcraft. And so that would, the style of work and the way we presented it initially drew people over, even though it was our own original creations, and we were able to build a following that way. So now back to this picture. Make-A-Wish was chosen one year to be the cover for the Expo art book. Most artists struggle with some insecurities, and mine is that I'm not the one doing the original pencils. I'm not the one coming up with the original creation. So I wanted to talk, I'm just coloring them. So I thought I'd like to show what I've added to this picture by showing the original pencil work and then talking a little bit about what went into the final picture. This piece in particular was a rush job. In fact, it was looking like we might not even submit a piece to the art book that year. I asked Aaron if he had any sketches, he could show me just ideas, and when he showed me a half-finished one of a fairy, it stuck with me, and I told him to finish it up quick. So that's the pencil work that I received. The rough natures of the pencil led me to use Corel Painter as opposed to doing a slicker piece in Photoshop. I'm used to not having a background, Aaron likes to focus on his time and effort on the characters. So I started creating a background in my 3D environment modeling software of choice, a program called View. But View doesn't have the modeling capability to pull off an up-close view for what I wanted her to be sitting on. So I sculpted the tree branch in ZBrush, a program I wish I get more time to play with. And then I did a paint over of the render out of ZBrush in Corel Painter to make it more integrated in the picture in the same style as her. And another thing that was lacking at the time and still largely is in painting programs is particles. So I turned to the motion graphics software After Effects and created the fairy dust particles in a particle plugin and rendered that out and integrated it into the piece as well. And then 5 years later, I came back to this picture, separated her and the tree limb out as a foreground transparent plane, re-rendered the background to gain a wider view, and placed that along with a rebuilt particle system inside the Unity game engine. And that is one of the scenes in our augmented reality app. And so that's a beta of our augmented reality app. Right now we just have it working with 5 of our pieces of our artwork, and I'll be adding more as time goes on, bringing fantasy to reality, bringing it to life with the magic of electronics. And that is the end of my presentation. Do we have any questions?
So I have a quick one. So what I see here, like you say you're a colorer.
Yes.
Is that an industry term that's applied to what you do? Because what I see, what you're doing is way more than coloring.
Yeah. I think I stick to the term colorist just from my background starting out in comic books, because that's certainly what the role is there. I do consider myself a little bit more of a digital painter. The more technical stuff, that's just my love affair with computers and playing with software.
Oh, okay. So you kind of talked about how you and your partner at DPI, you kind of have this duality of jobs. Like he's kind of like the main sketcher, and then you're the kind of colorer and augmenter of the original sketching. So do you find that that's often what happens in the industry? Like you have someone who's mostly in charge of sketching and someone who kind of takes the original sketch and plays with that, or do you have people who kind of do both?
In the comic book world, the vast majority of it was designed as an assembly line. And it was structured as one guy starts doing the pencil work, then you have an inker to refine it and clean it up, then it's passed on to a colorist and a letterer, so there's many people working together. And that's certainly the way it is in comics. It's starting to get a little blurred even in that, where one person may do the penciling and inking, some people do all 3 jobs. In fantasy illustration, we're actually kind of the odd thing. The vast majority of fantasy illustration is one person doing everything. There's not too many collaborations, Fassner and Larson being one of the most successful ones that I know of.
Do you think that kind of gives you an advantage or an edge in some form?
Actually, it's a major disadvantage. I quickly came to the realization that we probably would not be able to do this full time, because even though there's 2 of us, the theory being we could do double the amount of work, the problem is getting double the amount of work. It's a tough industry, and certainly when we were really trying to get into doing role-playing game illustrations, it's a little bit of a struggling market compared to video games. In fact, fun little story, the role-playing games I played as a child, many of them were by Palladium role-playing games, and Kevin, and I'll probably butcher the last name, Sembiita, was the name on all of those role-playing games. So one year early on, we went to Gen Con, which is the largest gaming convention in the United States. And I went to the Palladium booth with our portfolio. And I asked if there were any art directors reviewing portfolios at the show. And the person I talked to said, "Oh, you'll have to talk to Kevin." And I got a little nervous. And certainly I was introduced to Kevin Sambaida, the publisher. And I showed him my portfolio, and halfway through flipping through it, he's like, "This is great stuff. You know we pay shit, right?"
Just to be clear.
Yeah. So yes, unfortunately, it being the two of us, it's a little bit more of a disadvantage, actually.
Where do you find your work now?
Right now, primarily, we are selling at the comic book conventions around Canada. We do go down into the States a little bit, and you can order stuff online. We have a web store.
I'm curious about your process and how you work together. Is there any sort of feedback? So when Aaron's making his sketches, are you inputting, and when you're making your art, is he sort of...
It depends. It's a little bit both ways. But because we've been working together for so long now, like I say, over 20 years since we were working together in high school, we're pretty comfortable with each other. And it's more just like chatting and, oh, just a suggestion, or what do you think about this? But yeah, it's back and forth both ways.
So does he have any idea how it's going to look? Like when you get your hands on it, does he have any idea how it's going to end up?
I mean, you'd have to ask him that, but no, I think he's probably a little surprised each time at how it comes out. Yes?
You know, you've done a brilliant job as a colorist painting the picture of your life today, right?
Thank you.
And I really acknowledge that there's a humility and authenticity, and you get a sense of exactly where you came from and who you know yourself to be. But what's your dream?
He's living it.
Well, I think the dream for a lot of artists is be able to make a living off just doing the artwork you want to do. So yeah, certainly I think gaining a wider audience for the work that we do, and being able to do more of it, really. Yeah, and continue. The other thing that I've discovered about, you know, in life, being able to discover what makes you happy is a very important thing. And I think I've been lucky enough to discover what makes me happy. And surprisingly, it's not just creating the artwork, it's learning. And that's why I love playing with so much of the new software. And I never thought that I would ever program something in my life. And teaching myself how to program and learning that, and the rewarding moment when you're programming and you've got a bug and you're trying to figure out what is going wrong, when you have those aha moments, when you figure something out, or when you're able to make the code do something magical, that's what makes me happy. Learning and discovering new things as well.
So is your coding mostly related to this virtual?
Yeah, I first started out, the reason I first taught myself programming way back in the day when Flash was still a thing in the early days, learning how to program in ActionScript was a way of enhancing a game or a motion comic we were trying to do at the time. And so teaching myself programming was to enhance the artwork. And so now with the augmented reality, trying to make our own app and that sort of thing. Yeah.
Sure. Within your guys' partnership, is it like Aaron does like the character design, and is that where your inspiration comes off of that for what you do?
Oh, certainly.
Or do you get a chance when you get inspired, like are you both in sync enough that you can express it to him that he can start it off and then you finish it? Yeah,
I'll certainly suggest pieces to him. And suggest ideas for some pieces. One picture we did, I mean, certainly the design is still mostly him, like I said, there's always a little back and forth and suggestions. Well, one of our pieces was a birthday present to my wife, and it's when we used to play Dungeons and Dragons, her character's key moment was landing the killing blow on a dragon, and so I had that picture, Aaron draw that picture of her as her character with the dead dragon at her feet, kind of thing.
That's in your portfolio, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Can you please elaborate a little bit more on the augmented reality?
Sure. The augmented reality, certainly, I can't claim that I was the first one to do it. I saw a video online of someone applying it to an indie comic that they had created. And wow, the minute I saw that video, the lights went on and I just realized I have to do this. And I started researching online, looking for augmented reality APKs and the different ways that it's done and created. And so I did a few tests with different solutions and settled on one by Vuforia. And they have a plug-in to the Unity game engine, and based on previous work that I had done on some training simulators with Unity, I realized that would be the easiest way for me to get it done. And when I had discovered this, it was in December, and so that probably gave me 4 months to create a beta and have it ready at the Calgary Expo that next April. So being able to have a system that was plugged into a game engine that had half the work, certainly half the work done in that degree was a big benefit. And my problem with the augmented reality app now is the more mundane programming side of the reality of creating an app versus the fun of taking those scenes and doing the animation with my artwork.
Thanks.
Yes.
So do you work with story, or are these one-offs that your partner develops, you add on to, so there's no continuity as far as the story goes?
In the early years when we were attending the comic convention in Seattle, the comic convention was very comic book focused. And we'd have our art book for sale and people would walk up to the table, grab the art book and say, oh, what's the story? Because they're comic people and they're wanting a story. And no, it's just the artwork. A lot of those stories we had as kids when we were creating our comic books, some of the pieces contain characters from those stories. And we are toying, every couple of years we come back and we toy with the idea of putting out a comic once again, and we're back in that phase again of toying with that idea of, yes, finally creating a story for our characters.
So do you work with writers?
No professional ones yet. Certainly, maybe we'll talk after this. Yes?
You mentioned that you go to conventions and stuff and submit pieces and portfolios. Do you still do that and find that it's a bit more, like things are digital now, you can just send speculative stuff to houses and places. Do you still get time, or do you do any of that? Honestly, I have, I wouldn't say given up, but I don't do a lot of submissions anymore. Like I said, with the discouraging events that happened, I kind of came to the realization, you know, there was one particular job that we had gotten that paid quite poorly and demanded a crazy deadline, and at the end of the job I realized we literally could have made more money working at McDonald's. So when I came to that realization, and when we were doing, at the same time, we'd go to conventions and do well at the shows, I kind of decided, you know, I make more money working on pictures that I would want to work on anyways and selling them directly to the fans. So I really kind of stopped submitting to a lot of places. Yes?
How do you deal with maybe the frustration of competing with the less creative, those so-called fan art people who maybe just copying stuff? and then you're seeing them making lots of money right in front of you. Yeah, how do you deal with that? You know that you've gone through the process of creating something great, and these guys are just copying stuff.
Again, we didn't make that choice from a moral standpoint. We made that choice from, this is what we want to do. But I will say in the last couple of years with the downturn in the economy, seeing a few other guys at the show still doing well for themselves with copyrighted material, we may be doing a few pieces of our own. But I believe the way we will be doing it is interpreting characters in our style, in our steampunk kind of world, and bringing a little bit more of ourselves to those interpretations of popular characters. I've done a series of landscapes where I do them all in 3D software. And with those I wanted to get away from doing our own stuff, so I've done subtle copyright infringement with very subtle references to shows and movies that I like that aren't blatant fan art. And it's the type of work that a lot of times we'd have guys come up to our booth and see some of the more risque female pieces we do and I love the artwork, but my wife would never let me put it on the wall. And so when I did choosing to do the landscapes, I'm like, this is a piece of artwork that could hang in an office in downtown Calgary, but if you're a fan of the show and the subtle references in it, it's a little bit of a hidden nod to your fandom of choice that you like.
That's clever.
Easter egg.
Well, there's time for one more question.
Oh.
Unless we have some
Quick one.
two.
Okay. Do you know of any fan art of your art?
I'm not specifically aware of that. No, no. I'd certainly be interested. It would be would be a little bit of flattery.
All right, last question.
Mine is a little bit of follow-up to Steve you asked about an competitive advantage with respect to having a partnership. And you talked about it from a revenue and a business model perspective, but what about the creative process? And do you view it as being an advantage from the creative process?
Sure, certainly, yeah. Having two people from a creative aspect certainly, I think, is an advantage. Just in that regard, two minds are better than one, unless it ends up with the two of us yelling at each other like an old married couple, which, yeah, there were times after a phone call, my wife could not believe the way we were talking to each other, but we're still good friends. Well, thank you very much.